Okay, good evening everyone and welcome to tonight's Catchment Discovery event. I would like to start off this evening by just introducing myself. I'm Erin Masters and I am an Education and Engagement Officer with MidCoast Council. So we have a really great event for you tonight. As I said, it's part of our Catchment Discovery series. So if you've never been to one of our events before, welcome, but I know a lot of people have joined us in the past. So the Marine and Catchment Discovery Series is a great partnership program that MidCoast Council runs with local land services. So it's really a partnership, but it's also a way to get a lot of different scientists who are working on great projects here in the MidCoast area in to tell us a little bit more about their work, what they're doing, and give us a little bit more information about these great projects. So of course, the MidCoast waterways are some of the most important parts of our landscape. And it's healthy waterways that really keep our communities thriving. And of course, they're also really important for the wildlife that lives in our region. As locals, I think everybody knows that the last couple of years have been really, really harsh here in the mid-coast. We've had some really extreme climatic conditions. We've obviously had years of drought, some extreme bushfires, and then a lot of flooding rains as well. So all of this has an impact on our waterways. And one of those special animals that live here in this region that can be impacted by these events is, of course, the platypus, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight. So first thing I'm going to do is I would like to introduce Dr. Gillard Bino, who is a researcher with the University of New South Wales, and he's going to talk to us about the work he and his team recently undertook in the Manning Catchment.
Thanks for joining us on a virtual talk about the amazing platypus. I guess I'll be talking about some of the recent research activities to conserve and learn more about this amazing animal. And so I hope everyone is sitting back and relaxing with a glass or a cup of something. I've got my glass of wine here, so I'm ready to go. Hopefully I won't start slurring by the end. Before we begin, I would like to begin with acknowledging Aboriginal people as the first people and nations of the lands and waters we live and work upon, and pay my deepest and most sincere respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge and truly respect the deep spiritual connection and the relationship that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people have to country and their wisdom to live in harmony with nature. In order to personalize this virtual space, I'll start with a quick introduction. My name is Gilad, and here's a photo of me on a good day. And here's a photo of me on not such a good day. And there's Tennille, who just completed her PhD on the platypus and did much of the work I present here today. And Richard, the director of our research center, Center for Ecosystem Science, who's been a true champion of conservation of freshwater ecosystems in particular for many, many years. I've been researching freshwater species for almost a decade at the University of New South Wales. And I've become involved in platypus conservation about 5 years ago and formed the Platypus Conservation Initiative as part of a greater research project with a broader aim of increasing our understanding of the platypus and improving our conservation of it and renewing our connection and respect to this extraordinary animal and the rivers in which it inhabits. If you'd like to know more about the platypus, I guess I recommend two resources as a starting point. One is, of course, the book called Platypus. You can't misinterpret that one, written by Dr. Tom Grant, who spent a lifetime researching the platypus. Another lighter read is a paper we wrote, which gives a more concise review about our current knowledge of the species and the many threats to its existence. For Aboriginal people, the platypus has many names and spiritual connections. We know that they were hunted for food by digging them from their burrows or spearing them while swimming. The platypus tail is rich in fats, so it may be particularly important in cold conditions. Aboriginal people had a deep knowledge of the platypus and its life history, which was unfortunately sometimes overlooked by early naturalists. I'm aware of two Dreamtime stories. One from the upper reaches of the Darling River around Narran begins with a young duck who disregarded her tribe's warning of Molucca, the water devil, and ventured down the creek far from her tribe. The duck was then abducted by Bigun, a water rat, who took her as his wife. The duck eventually escaped and returned to her tribe, where she laid 2 eggs, which hatched as platypuses. They had soft fur instead of feathers, 4 webbed feet instead of 2, and spurs on their hind legs like Bigun's spear, the water rat. But the duck and her 2 different children were banished from her tribe, choosing to live far away in the mountains. I like this story because it gives a geographic perspective a bit about the people that lived within the Murray-Darling Basin in the western flowing rivers, and their perspective about the platypus that inhabits the upper reaches of the catchment. A second dreaming from the Central Coast in New South Wales begins with the ancestor spirits deciding on totems. The bird, marsupials, fish all go and ask the platypus to join their particular family. But then the platypus goes and consults with the echidna, and the platypus graciously declines, explaining that it shares traits with all groups, and wishes to remain friends with all of them, rather than belong to one single group. The platypus then commemorates the Great Spirit for making all the animals different and respecting its wisdom. Now, before we begin, to address our number 1 question, what is the plural term of platypus? We get platypi or we get platypuses. Well, it's platypuses, yes. The word comes from the Greek, not the Latin word, meaning flatfoot, unlike octopi, which is Latin. If you wanted, you can probably get away with platypodes or even platypoda, but I suspect that you'd even sound sillier. So we stay with platypuses. What we know of the platypus has definitely been increasing, picking up pace, particularly since 1990. You can see on the left there is like the accumulated number of studies, annual number of studies on the platypus. And today we know much better about the platypus than what was originally thought to be a hoax when the first specimens arrived England, which kind of makes me wonder if that's something which often happened back in the days. Our knowledge is not from across the platypus's entire range. We can see that on the map on the right in terms of indicating the number of studies that have been considering the platypus, which kind of limits our ability to understand how it's responding to both natural and human-driven changes to its environment. And so that varies across the species distribution. So I'll get into that soon. Our story begins, our story of the platypus begins millions of years ago, when dinosaurs were still roaming the earth in a land called Gondwana, which was at the time a combination of South America, Antarctica, and Australia. The first monotrim evolved way before placental and marsupial diverged. So in a sense, it's a lineage that is seated deep in time. The platypus is truly an extraordinary animal. It's retaining and evolving many strange features, all jumbled into one, like Gruffalo. I don't know if you know that children's storybook. And it displays both mammalian and reptilian characteristics. It moves on the land more like a crocodile rather than most mammals, but swims rather gracefully with its webbed feet. It's got venomous spurs, carried only by the males, which, if you would get spurred, would deal pain for as much as 6 months. So please be careful. Avoid platypuses. We suspect that their use of such deadly weapons are more to do with fending off other males for access to females during the breeding season than it is to do with defending against predators. It has, of course, a leathery duck-like bill, and for some reason, 5 pairs of sex chromosomes, whereas we just have one. Cute puggles, platypuses. So the platypus is only one of 5 egg-laying mammals building a nest deep in burrows they build in the banks of rivers and creeks. After a few days of laying her eggs, the little puggles emerge with tiny teeth, which we think might help them chew their way out of the egg, but then they quickly lose them, and platypuses are only left with grinding pads. They are reared by their mom, which has mammary glands, and so the little puggles lap this milk up, which secretes, like the milk has very potent antibacterial properties. After about 3 months, the platypuses leave and never to return. In some cases, Jessica Thomas, she's a researcher, an amazing researcher at Hillsville Sanctuary, who's gave us these amazing photos. Sometimes she's been breeding platypuses for some quite time, and she has noticed that on occasion, female platypuses would actually push her platypus young out into the water and collapse the entrance, in a sense, figuratively speaking, throwing away the keys. The platypus is, of course, an Australian icon, and as such, it really connects us with the natural environment, particularly the rivers and creeks of Eastern Australia, which give us so much in return for our protection. Platypuses spend most of its time in the water, feeding on various macroinvertebrates, so like bugs and larvae and things like that inhabit creeks and shallow lakes. And they rely on really a healthy and productive riparian zone with lots of vegetation and stable earth banks and large overhanging trees and plenty of organic matter and complexity like fallen trees. They love deep pools, which offer plenty of resources, which are also really, really important as refugia, particularly during dry conditions. The platypus extends far from North Queensland down to Tasmania, along Australia's east, in both the eastern and western flowing rivers. Though in the latter, the western flowing rivers, the rivers there have been severely degraded by water resource development and land clearing. And they occur also on 2 islands, King Island off Tasmania, and a small introduced population on Kangaroo Island. There were attempts at introducing platypuses to WA, but I don't think they survived. So a mystery still to be discovered. For our audience in the MidCoast area, so platypuses have been recorded relatively recently throughout the Manning Catchment, with some areas of uncertainty, particularly in the western parts of the catchment. There are a large number of human-driven threatening processes that are impacting platypuses across their range and their habitat, starting with European hunting, when thousands of furs were traded in the big markets, where a single rug required more than 50 platypus skins, as you can see down there in the middle. The fur trade was finally banned in 1912. But then since then, land clearing, water resource development, along with destruction of riparian vegetation and unrestricted access of livestock to rivers have been fragmenting populations, destroying river banks, increasing runoff and sedimentation, which really smothers the rivers. Invasive species also increase the risk of predation, particularly during platypus overland movements, during droughts, when platypuses are known to kind of try and find deeper pools, so they move. We've heard many accounts of fox dens with platypus bones around. Upper house traps, which were just recently and finally banned in Victoria and the ACT, are still legal in some New South Wales rivers and are a real death trap for platypuses. They're so cheap, a fisherman can just throw them in illegally in any river and forget or never come back, and one trap can continuously kill platypuses. So they're really, really dangerous. Even hair ties and loose fishing lines can cause strangulation. Under the IUCN Red Listing, which is a global standard for assessing extinction risk of species, the platypus is currently listed as near threatened, which implies a decline not exceeding about a third in the species range and number over the course of three generations, which is 3 platypus generations, 3 decades, which are 3 platypus generations. This, at the time, 2016, was only based on a small number of long-term monitoring programs that did detect declines. In South Australia, the platypus is listed as threatened, given it's all but gone from the state. And in Victoria, the platypus has just been nominated for listing as a threatened only a couple of months ago, given observed declines across the state and continued impact to its habitat. We're yet to see the final call on this nomination. At the federal level, the platypus isn't listed as threatened on the EPBC Act. However, at the moment, we're in the process of making a thorough assessment of current knowledge, which I'll share with you some of it, of past and present numbers. So in relation, recently Tennille looked at historical newspaper articles, which have been digitized by the Australian National Library and are available to anyone. She looked for articles relating to platypuses, documenting any records of observations and attitudes of people over the past century. In her study, we came across a number of articles mentioning platypus numbers, which were much larger than what we see today in most places, even when doing our best to catch them. When we summarize historical observations along with any survey data that someone has done in the area, obviously trying to get the specific observation in the same exact location as the survey is difficult. But nonetheless, some patterns still emerge. I think we noticed that in some areas in the past, they used to record far many platypuses. People sometimes, I don't know if they were exaggerating, but people were referring to platypuses as like a platypus migration, observing platypuses in the glider, or referring to platypuses as a mob of platypuses. And so I think today, when we go out and survey and do all of the effort, and we've caught 250 platypuses to date, and the most we've caught, it was 7 in one pool in a night, whereas people used to see, dozens. There's a term in psychology, it's called shifting baselines, which refers to a shift in our collective memory of how we perceive the world around us and the changes that have occurred. This happens when we don't have good records or good data to refer to. But it's quite apparent when we actually dig through old records, and then it becomes quite apparent. For example, there's the passenger pigeon, which numbered in billions and was described to darken the skies of North America, but was driven to extinction very rapidly by humans. Another example, our fish stock, which have been depleted from our oceans. This is one example. You can see kind of the trophy fishing over the years. In 1957, there's like these amazing beasts that come out of the water. In 1980, look at how many. And then in 2007, that's it. So without these documented photography, images or surveys, we wouldn't know. We would come and today you go and you see a couple of platypuses and you go, oh, wow, I've seen a couple of platypuses, amazing, so many. But that might not have been the case. Once maybe our rivers were teeming with platypuses and other wildlife. I mean, I'm sure that, yeah. As for the platypus specifically, if we don't know much to go when trying to assess changes in distribution, we rely mostly on opportunistic sightings, anyone that records an observation of platypus at any time. We can see that the numbers of observations have definitely increased considerably, particularly in the turn of the millennia as people had more access to GPS and smartphones. But in recent decades seems to have tapered off. I wouldn't look at the last bracket because 2020. So just if you look at the second and third last. This pattern doesn't emerge when we're comparing opportunistic sightings. Sorry, I'm in the Hunter Valley. This pattern doesn't emerge when we look at other native species. So it does seem to suggest that maybe numbers have been dwindling, or at least the probability of detection, even though effort has increased. On the map on the right, you can also see large areas where we simply don't have any sightings, but suspect they may occur. Those are marked in gray. The last year of sighting there on the map on the right are anything red is we haven't seen them for 30 years. Anything yellow is just like the past 20 years, 20 years. Green is over the past decade. In 2016, we embarked on a 3-year research project to improve our understanding about the impacts of large dams and river regulation on platypus populations. We traveled across New South Wales and Victoria. We set up these mobile research camps from which we explored the platypuses and their habitats. Of course, most of our work is at night. We set out a few hours before dusk, we find a spot, and then we spend the rest of the night with the nets we set and the amazing wildlife that wakes up. We set nets either in shallow streams using fyke nets on your left, or in deep pools, we set a mesh net. It's kind of an unweighted mesh net, and we go out with our tinny and we go back and forth and take any platypuses we catch or any fish and things like that. We set back into the water immediately. When we catch a platypus, with all the efforts, on average, we catch 2 per night. Sometimes, like I said, the maximum is 7. But when we do catch a platypus, given all the effort, we make sure we examine it from all the angles, literally. And we take various samples, taking biopsies of blood and looking parasites, swabbing here and there, taking cheek pouch samples. You can see there, like we scoop out bits of food from inside the platypus's cheek and we tag them. So if we ever trap them again, we get a better understanding of population size. We anesthetize the animals to try and ensure that it, as well as us, go through the process in a peaceful and dreamy manner. We try to minimize our stress on the animals. So that's our kind of mobile setup. When in our surveys, we found the platypus numbers varied across different rivers, generally low in the upper Murray, where populations may still have been recovering from the millennium droughts, actually. So we did this in 2016, and it wasn't relatively in platypus generation times, it wasn't that long. Where the lowest number of platypuses that we caught was directly downstream of Dartmouth Dam on the Mida, which, although was really beautiful on the outside, was rather ugly on the inside, so to speak, in terms of platypus and their prey. Really very low numbers of platypuses. And we suspect this is because the river is largely operated as an irrigation channel, transporting water to Hume Dam and meeting irrigation demands. Constantly, this has disrupted the natural flow regime of the river. In contrast, we found really high numbers of platypuses on the Snowy River directly downstream of Jindabyne Dam, where the large number of platypuses are probably a result of over a decade of significant water restoration, returning some of the water back to the Snowy after a long period of degradation during this time by drawing water away from the Snowy into the west, actually into the Murray-Darling Basin. So they've slowly been returning a bit of the water, and definitely noticeable. Drying up and droughts are one of the most extreme events to freshwater systems, including platypuses, either naturally or mediated through human development and climate change. During the extreme dry conditions last year, we received many phone calls and heard of many instances of platypus deaths, or platypuses stranded in remnant pools. Unfortunately, there's not much we can do given the really limited capacity of zoos to house platypuses, which we're hoping with some government support will improve in the future. We also really can't take a platypus and move it to another river because that would impose significant stress to the resident platypuses that are probably also suffering. However, there was one exception. Platypuses in Tidinbilla Nature Reserve in the ACT. There's a sanctuary there and a mosaic of ponds. And we know there are platypuses there, but as the pools were drying out last year, we went and collected 7 platypuses from the sanctuary and transported them to Taronga Zoo for safekeeping. Since the water returned, we put them happily back into their home, but this time with tiny trackers, an array of listening stations. So the stations, what you see there are the photo, they are not the trackers. And we're hoping that we'll be able to track their movements across the different pools and see how they're responding to varying conditions over the next year and a half. So it would give us a kind of a full cycle of seasons to see when pools are drying up and they're kind of when they move. So we did better understand how they respond to droughts. We're already learning much more. For example, as represented by colored dots on the maps here. I don't know if you can see, but you'll have to trust me. The relative, you'll notice on the left, female platypuses, the 4 maps there. It seems like the female platypuses are, more concentrated and localized in their movements. But on the right, in comparison, the male is just moving all over the place and utilizing different pools that the people there at the villa didn't realize. And so this is likely the male platypus is likely searching for female platypuses during the breeding season, which is unfolding now. We know in the wild, platypuses can travel dozens of kilometers. And so, yeah, that I guess highlights the issue of fragmenting populations and things like that. But fire is an integral part of the Australian environment. It interacts and is driven by many factors, including the plants, the climate, and of course the topography. Fire, of course, impacts terrestrial environment. I mean, that's a given, but it also does impact freshwater, the freshwater realm, either directly, often mediated by actually the surrounding vegetation, but it also indirectly. Fire can increase runoff following extreme fires, and then rains that increase runoff and sedimentation into the rivers, which impact water quality, even to the extent of mass fish kills that were recently recorded in the Macleay River. So following the large fires that swept through much of New South Wales and the preceding dry conditions, we were really concerned for the platypuses, and we wanted to try and gauge how the platypuses were impacted by such, such ferocity of fires and droughts. And we wanted to understand how the populations were resilient. And so we, without any knowledge about, we didn't have any knowledge about where platypuses occurred before the fire, so we can come back after the fires and compare. That again, that data, it's a bit of this catch-22, but that data doesn't exist. So we've been working with MidCoast Council for a while, collaborating on different research ideas and things like that. And conversations that we had, we realized that looking at the MidCoast Council, MidCoast area, sorry, could be quite, I guess, strategic in terms of assessing the impacts of fire on platypuses. We focused on Dingo Creek that flows into the Manning, which was both directly and indirectly impacted by the fire. And right on the other side of the range, there's the Thone River that flows through Comboyne, which acted a bit of as a control. It wasn't impacted by the fire, but was as equally impacted by the droughts. When we were there, we heard stories by, recollections by people noticing how the river was drying out for the first time in their recollection. So we set out for 2 weeks between July and August. You might have seen us driving around in our Platmobile. And if you ever wondered why we have the boat facing the wrong way up, particularly when it's raining, that's because we carry so much equipment that doesn't really fit in the car. So we go around with that boat and sometimes have to fill it out, empty it out. The differences between the two rivers, the Dingo, the Burnt, and the Thone, were quite apparent as we were setting up our nets for the night. On the left, you can see Dingo Creek, 6 months after the fires, and on the right, the Thone River. The first thing that we noticed was the low understory vegetation, which was really dominated by weeds along many parts of Dingo Creek. And what was really strange at night, we also heard less frogs calling. That was that became apparent when we started in Dingo, and when we moved to the zone and we all of a sudden heard all these frogs, that became much more apparent, the contrasts between the two. We also looked at bugs and the things that, the yummy things that platypuses like to eat. There were definitely still plenty of bugs in Dingo Creek, but they seem to be less mayflies and yabbies and beetles. In the upper reaches of Dingo Creek, along Kipax Road, we only caught, if you see there in these bubbles, you see one way up there. We only caught one platypus over 5 nights using 20 nets. So that's, that when you catch per unit effort, it's very, very low. Just next to Bobbin Creek, just next to Bobbin School, we caught one platypus there marked in blue when we were using our mesh nets in deeper parts of the river. Further down in really deep and lovely water holes near Marlee and Duff's Bridge, we caught 3 platypuses over 2 nights. In comparison, you can see on the zone there, we caught 2 platypuses over 2 nights. You've got 3 there marked because one was a recapture, damn you. But it's good to see that they're definitely moving around. So that was all right. And when we set traps out in a deep deep pool on the Thone River, we caught 4 platypuses in one night. So as you can see, the numbers were quite greater on the unburnt area. When using fykes in the upper reaches, it seemed to be 10 times higher. We also noticed that we caught more males platypuses than females, which really makes us wonder why that is, and whether the timing of the fires and the dry conditions right before has to do something with the breeding season that was actually occurring at the time. And so, yeah, more to still uncover. During our survey, really the one thing that stood out were the deep pools and the habitat they offer. They were amazing, particularly during dry conditions. They were so important. Several residents described to us that during these times they observed platypuses congregating in these pools. And since the water returned, the numbers seem to have dwindled. So maybe they're returning back to their foraging grounds and burrows. We're hoping to return in March after the breeding season and to see how the platypuses are faring. We really are excited to see maybe platypus young that will tell us about, again, how they're, how resilient and the kind of the bounce back of platypus populations are in the area. One of the most rewarding experiences in conservation is really engaging with people and instilling awe and respect to the nature around us. Seeing kids' eyes shine bright with excitement. We did this platypus camp with amazing kids. And to see their eyes shine bright with excitement when they see and touch a platypus for the first time. Like I said, we anesthetize the animal sleeping, and they can just really get close and touch, and amazing. And of course, my kids there, I'm a bit biased, but my kids, they come with me, and sometimes they help me survey platypuses, which is amazing. Yeah, so to see this excitement in kids is so worth the effort. There's still much to learn about platypus, and you could definitely help. There's so much more to learn. Recording sightings of platypus. If you see a platypus, you can record. That is very important. And can easily be done through the Atlas of Living Australia or an iNaturalist. You can also download their app on your smartphone and become a real naturalist as you go. Recording, you can just start recording wild animals around you. That data really, really helps. You can also join land care initiatives that undertake inspiring and important restoration of vegetation, and particularly riparian vegetation. So contact your local land care coordinator. Fencing off the riparian vegetation to prevent livestock access is very important for maintaining stable banks and platypus habitat. And those kind of initiatives are often supported by the local land services. And also, as I mentioned, identifying and protecting these deep water holes is critical for the resilience of many freshwater species. And Matt, after me, will talk about this. Without getting too political, you can also vote wise at the local, state, and federal level. You can make sure that your representatives prioritize protecting the environment, not at the expense of unsustainable development. A balance can be struck. Unfortunately, Australia has a very, very poor track record. Australia has the highest mammal extinction in the world and one of the worst land clearing rates in the world, the highest in developing countries. So we can do so much more to protect our environment and ensure, our well-being, as well as an amazing natural environment. I would like to thank my deepest thanks to the lovely community of the area that have allowed us into their homes, particularly Paul and Megan, who invited us to stay in their place on some cold and rainy nights. Thank you so much. Really appreciated. The kids love the pie. Also, my thanks to Karen Betnick and who helped us coordinate the surveys, and Aaron Masters for obviously organizing this event. And our many thanks to WWF for the financial support on this project. So thank you so much.
First of all, thank you, Gilad, for taking us through all that. There's some really interesting research there, and so great to hear that these things are happening in the Manning River as well. With so much happening in this area, it's really interesting to see that this research is being undertaken. We do have one question straight off the bat, and you sort of talked about it a little bit at the end, but this was from Kim, talking about the citizen science side of things. So that was what you were just mentioning about making sure that we're actually recording those findings, and if you see one, to actually record it. So you actually talked about it a little bit anyway, but Kim, to your friend that just saw them near Walker, that's a perfect way, and we can always put that ALA Atlas of Living Australia link out there as well. And as Gilad said, you can also download it to your mobile, so that's perfect. Yeah,
please. Like you notice, like we're really relying on these observations to try and detect changes over time. And so if you saw when you looked at that map, there were large areas with gray. So if you want to challenge yourself, go out to one of those gray areas and record a platypus for the first time. Like that would be amazing. So the challenge is on.
Well, and that actually sort of leads us into our next question, which is from Jackie, who said that there was no mention of the Barrington River, which is obviously because this particular study didn't take place in the Barrington. We were taking place in Dingo Creek. But are you aware? I know that they would definitely be up there, but do you have any knowledge or any information on those in that area, the Barrington?
You're going to have to get back to me. I'll have to. If you want, give me a call. Or you can go on the Atlas of Living Australia. Just go there, have a look. You can see when was the last one. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to make sure that you're recording those things, because absolutely at any time you can go. And it's not just the platypus, obviously. The Atlas of Living Australia is a great resource for looking at lots of different species and what's around and those sorts of things. For instance, council representatives found a yellow-bellied glider the other night, so that we'll record that and go on there. So really important to be making reference to those things and knowing what's around. So it's really important.
I mean, of course, like in terms of research and rigor and things like that, obviously there are biases in the data, but we try and consider those when we're trying to evaluate different patterns and changes over time.
And so just to follow up, Jackie also asked about echidnas. So same thing, you can upload any of that data in the CA, Jackie, anything that you find. So what I'll do is actually I'll in a moment when we're doing Matt's presentation, I'll get the link for that and I'll actually upload it into the chat so that everybody can see it if you're interested to go and have a little bit more of a look at that site. Okay, just having a look at some of the other questions here. And actually, I noticed people are using the chat too. So just if you do have questions, if you could use the Q&A, please. That's perfect. So this is an interesting question. I'm not really sure so the question from Barbara is, does the release of the Tasmanian devils into Barrington Tops affect platypus numbers? I think probably the first thing to recognise there is that release that was done is actually in a specialised area. It's actually an enclosed space. So it's not actually, they're not just being let out into the Barrington Top, that it is just still an enclosed space, just a larger area than what they've had previously. But Gila, did you have any, what do you think might?
Yeah, okay, so let's predators of platypuses.
Yeah.
Yeah, predators of platypuses, I guess that would be an impact. I mean, first of all, by introducing the Tasmanian devil there, potentially they would potentially suppress foxes, maybe cats as well. And so I think suppressing these invasive species would then have obviously a top to bottom effect. So potentially might suppress predation of platypuses. So which could be a net benefit. I don't know if the devils are platypus predators. I don't think so. I don't think there's any evidence in Tasmania. But I guess, historically, maybe the thylacine, Tasmanian tiger, was a predator. Snakes, maybe they make their way into burrows. I know the female platypuses, when she's young, she blocks some of the tunnels. So I think that might be a defensive mechanism against snakes, maybe. Eagles, maybe sea eagles and things like that, birds of prey. Maybe in the past when you had like the big cods, the 100-year-old cods, the big, ones, they could maybe even swallow a little puggle. Like the puggles, I didn't talk about the size. The platypus is about maybe 60 centimeters long. There's a big geographic variation, so they get smaller up in the north. Maybe crocodiles up north. I don't know. We have yet to wrestle crocodiles while we're surveying for platypuses. Maybe that's like a limit to their upper reaches. It should be interesting. Yeah, I think that's a bit amount. I think I would assume releasing a native predator that once occurred in Australia, the Tasmanian tiger, would have a net benefit. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Paul, who lives in the Mackay River. He has noticed that the platypus in front of the house in a deep part of the river since the fires and water quality has declined, still but not back to normal, and definitely a decline in platypus numbers.
Yeah.
So we're wondering if there's anything we can do to monitor or help them. So obviously making sure that we're registering those sightings as well, but did you have any other?
It depends how serious you are. Who is this? Who's the user? Who's the person?
His name is Paul Smith.
Paul. So you're welcome to email me if you wanted to be serious about it and do, like, if you wanted to really track there. Go there maybe once every 3 months, spend half an hour around dusk, record how long you spent there, record how many platypuses you saw, make sure you note that, and if you did that consistently every 3 months, let's track this over time. So you just have to do this maybe 4 times a year. Track this over time, and that would allow us to better understand how the population is recovering. So in terms of increasing knowledge and in terms of getting active in land care and restoring riparian vegetation, if there are any initiatives around there, that would be great. Making sure, getting curious about, the river and the health of the river and the sedimentation and things like that, and making sure everyone in the catchment is responsible. Yeah, there's lots and lots and lots to do.
Okay, and we have a question from Mela Luca, who is 7, and she would like to know why platypus only come out at night.
Why platypuses come only at night? Maybe I can ask Titos, who's just a bit over 7. You want to try and answer why platypuses come only at night? Could you? Not sure. So maybe predators, maybe the food. So they don't use sight. They don't need sight. When they dive and look for food, they close their eyes. They've got relatively tiny eyes. They close their eyes and they dive for a minute to 3 minutes. And they have at the tip of their bill, they have like electroreceptors and even mechanoreceptors, so they can feel electric current that animals put out. Water is a really good conductor, so they can sense their food with their bills. So they close their eyes and they forage at the bottom of creeks and rivers. So they really don't need the eyesight. So it doesn't, day or night, doesn't really matter for them. They're more active in winter. So maybe there's, around thermoregulation. Maybe the water is really nice and cool at night. They don't overheat. I think that might be maybe the biggest driver there. Maybe like a physiological mechanism there. This is just me, spitting out. But yeah. So and when the stuff that they eat, when they emerge, that also might be at night. So they might actually are active when their food is active. So it could be like a combination of these things. But great question, and thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so we do have lots more questions. I'm just going to ask one more, and then if we've got time at the end after our second presentation, we'll cycle back around and answer some more questions.
Yeah, let's stay on for hours. Yeah.
So the other question is from Anne, and she's just asking, do they have teeth?
Do they have feet?
Yeah.
They've got 4 limbs, yes. They move really quickly on land. Fortunately for us, in relatively straight lines. If they sometimes get away for because we catch them and we move them to the car in pillowcases. We make sure the pillowcases tight and close and all that, and they relax. But sometimes they can even scratch their way out and try and get their way back to the river. So so they've got feet. The back feet, they're more stubby looking, and so they fold them inwards into the tail, and then they use the tail to maneuver in the water, and they use their front hand limbs, which are webbed and are quite agile. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so as I said, we'll cycle back to some of those questions, and we've got a second presentation. So if you want to ask more questions, keep using that Q&A function. But thank you, Gilad. That was fantastic. Really great presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
For the moment, though, as I said at the beginning, MidCoast Council is aware of just how important our waterways are. And we're working really hard to protect them, not just for water quality, but also for the animals that live in them, not just the platypus, but many river turtles, fish, all sorts of different things as well. And this area has really had some difficulties with different climatic conditions in the last little while. So MidCoast Council is aware of this and is working on a new project. So I'm going to invite our senior ecologist, Matt Bell, to join us now. And Matt's going to talk a little bit about a Refugia project that MidCoast Council is working on in conjunction with a few other partners. So Matt, if you would like to join us.
Thank you, Gilad. That was a fascinating presentation. I learned a lot, and welcome and thank you to everybody who's tuning into this. I am Council Senior Ecologist and I've worked in the area since 2002. My family hail from the Wingham, Kapara and Boban areas, so I have a deep personal connection to this region, its biodiversity, its landscapes and its waterways. The focus of tonight's webinar is the platypus, but it's also a really good opportunity for us to discuss a project that Council is delivering in partnership with Hunter Local Land Services, and that project is focused on aquatic refuges. And the Council lead for the Aquatic Refuge project, who I'd recognise for her immense work on this, is Dr. Karen Batink. What are aquatic refuges, or hydrologic refugia? So refugia is defined as areas in which a population of organisms can survive through a period of unfavourable conditions. In an aquatic sense, they are areas of relatively high water availability in a river, creek or wetland system. So when we think of aquatic refugia, I picture the deep enduring pools, or the spring-fed pools, the pools that are fed by groundwater inflows, or those persistent and lowest parts of wetland systems. So these are the areas we talk about when we speak about aquatic refuges. And they can occur across the whole length of a watercourse, and importantly, at or near their headwaters. And the groundwater fed pools are particularly valuable. I saw this personally when doing monitoring work after the fires in December of 2019, when in the Boban Creek area, and despite the region not having any substantial rain for 6 months or so, there was a persistent base flow, a very small, very clean, persistent base flow. And these base flows are very important to the system, and so are deep, lasting pools. When the riffles and the shallow pools are all completely dry, this is where those persisting remnants of plant and animal populations have got to hold on until flows return. So why are aquatic refuges important? So they provide critical strongholds that allow aquatic plants, aquatic and semi-aquatic animals, and even terrestrial animals that require access to surface water for drinking and other purposes. They provide those strongholds for them to persist during drought and other events. And the types of animals we are talking about, and not only the platypus, but species such as Manning River helmeted turtles, eel-tailed catfish, Australian bass, and freshwater mussels. As I say, it also includes in-stream and riparian plants, some frogs, and a variety of land animals. But not just environmentally, these refuge pools are incredibly valued socially and recreationally for swimming, canoeing, fishing, nature watching, photography. We all get a great buzz out of seeing platypus in the wild. These refuge pools support local nature-based tourism. We're all very aware of how nature-based tourism contributes to our regional economy. We think of some local iconic camping grounds that are centred around deep pools on our local rivers. They're really attractive places to visit, and I personally have a range of favourite local aquatic refuges that I go to and where I take my family to. These spring-fed pools and the deep pools do also provide and maintain water for the environment. As Gilad has indicated, the 2019 drought was particularly severe, and the 2019 drought highlighted the critical importance of local refuges. Our region received about 1/3 of our normal annual rainfall, and this fell predominantly in the first half of the year. There were many observations of fish kills, of bass, of mullet, of gudgeons and catfish, as well as the reports and observations of dead and dying platypus and turtles in local rivers. Significant predation was expected to have occurred to animals as the pools dried, and the fauna within these streams were exposed or forced to undertake overland movement. And Aussie Ark significantly undertook rescue missions for Manning River helmeted turtles and platypus. So our local rivers were significantly affected, and thus the recovery of these affected species critically depends on their persistence in aquatic refuges. So what threatens aquatic refuges, and Gilad covered this in commentary around what threatens platypus populations, and it's pollution, it's sediment inflows, it's stock access and other pollutants in waterways, it's water extraction, or unsustainable water extraction, it's the degradation of riparian zones, it's weeds and feral pest animals, climate change, which the model suggests will create a hotter, drier climate, hydrological changes, the dams, the weirs, the barriers to fish passage, as well as exploitation. And thus, we clearly recognise the value of aquatic refuges and their sensitivity to disturbance and impact. So what do we do in order to protect them? Principally 3 things. We need to understand the location and condition of important refuges. We need to work together to better manage these assets for their social, economic and environmental benefits. And this needs to recognise that many of these important aquatic refuges occur on private freehold land rather than within the public land system. And finally, we need to use knowledge to assist management efforts. And that includes both scientific knowledge, but also community knowledge. Which leads me to discuss our Manning Catchment Hydrologic Refugia project. It is a pilot project, and in this respect, we have engaged expert scientists from the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and the Environment, and they're using a variety of scientific models and spatial assessment methods to identify the locations and types of aquatic refugia in two subcatchments. One is the Dingo Creek catchment and one is the Barnard River catchment. And these have been chosen because they represent quite different subcatchments of the Menning system in terms of land uses, vegetation cover, hydrology, and topography. The science from the models and the surveys and the assessments will be combined with community and landholder knowledge. And the ultimate aim is to identify those areas of those catchments that stay wet over time, particularly stay wet during periods of dry times, low rainfall. And this is where the aquatic, the hydrologic refugia will be located. The project also, a second part of the project also involves an examination of the distribution of key indicator species. We've chosen a small number of animals that need water at all times to persist and which have relatively low mobility in the landscape. And these species include freshwater macroinvertebrates, crayfish, platypus, freshwater mussels, and the Menning River helmeted turtle. And the project will use knowledge of these species occurrences to identify important refuges and to validate some of the modelling and spatial assessment work. And we know that if we can protect these indicator species, then we can also protect a range of other plants and animals in the landscape. So they act as umbrella species in terms of conservation outcomes. So in terms of the outcomes, the project has an applied focus. In this regard, we refer to the Goethe quote, "Knowing is not enough, we must apply. Willing is not enough, we must do." So the outcomes that we seek are to understand where the important aquatic refuges are so we can work collectively to protect these refuges. It's to identify and deploy protection and restoration actions at priority sites. Through doing that, we can achieve enhanced social, environmental and biodiversity outcomes for the entire Menning catchment. The protection and restoration actions that could be applied to specific priority refuges might include weed controls, riparian enhancement, stock exclusion fencing, pest control, in-stream restoration work, such as introducing additional coarse woody debris in-stream, bank stabilisations, conservation agreements, as well as long-term monitoring. And there would be significant benefits for platypus and many other plants and animals, and ultimately our entire community, if we can work together with the community, with the research scientists, and with the agencies to achieve these outcomes. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Rose had the first question, and she asked, how often do platypus breed?
The short answer would be maybe every second year. It really depends. Tom Grant did this study, so literally spent a lifetime, 40 years going back to the same pool every year and really doing a survey. So really undertaking the hard work, the actual surveys, that's the only way we can know about demographics, about breeding. Like, their opportunistic observations are really valuable. eDNA is great in some instances, but really undertaking like actual you capture, you mark, you release over time gives you a good understanding of the population, the demographics, males and females and young, and so it gives you the whole cycle. So Tom Grant spent 40 years going to the same pool, so this is really what we're kind of relying on. And he found that you can give them, the females, a bit of oxytocin, and see if they're lactating during the breeding season. Sorry, tractor going by. And so he found that, on average, every second year, platypus females were breeding. And so males probably have access to a number of females as well. So, on a whole, you have this like population dynamics going on. Yeah.
Does climate change or these bushfire and climate influences affect the balance of gender? So is there more males than females?
I would say yes. Generally, if we're talking about the species in general, I would say that would have an impact. I think in some cases you might have certain sexes more susceptible to drying, maybe. And I think in some conditions, like if some populations, when the population is small, they might be able to actually regulate some species. I'm not saying platypus, but some species might be able to regulate sex ratios depending on population size, fish, you know, and platypuses are, they're pretty, I don't know in terms of their evolution and their capacity to regulate sex and things like that, but that would be a valid hypothesis to test. Well put, like in that sense.
Excellent. So Sue had an interesting question, and Matt, you might be able to help me answer this one. It's probably a little bit more council focused, and that is about the issues associated with allowing livestock into waterways. Now I'll start off with backing up some of what Matt said before, which is that a lot of that waterway frontage is actually in private ownership, so it's not public managed land. But I will say that both MidCoast Council and Hunter Local Land Services are working really hard to work with landholders and to try to get those areas fenced off. There's different grants and things available, different projects that we're undertaking. So we've been very focused on the Manning tonight, but for instance, there was a local project undertaken in the Karua where 8 landholders have actually gotten together with grant funding from MidCoast Council, Hunter Local Land Services, and then also funding from the landholders themselves. And they've actually fenced off large areas, not only of the riparian zone, but also wetland zones that were actually located on their properties. And there's now over 240 hectares of that wetland protected from livestock. So it really is a partnership. It's working with landholders to make sure that they're aware of the issues associated with livestock into waterways, working with them to help fence off those riparian zones and things like that. So there's certainly work being undertaken in that space, but it's not all there yet. We are working with landholders to try to get a little bit better at that. Matt, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I think, yeah, as you say, it is definitely a partnership. We're dealing with private land holdings, and yeah, there's a history of working with landholders to achieve good outcomes in riparian zones in terms of excluding stock, and there are often production benefits of that as well in terms of the concurrent provision of off-stream watering, which stock prefer. It's good for the water systems. It's good for the production system as well. And so there will be continued programs to work in combination with private landholders to continue the work that's been done to improve the condition and health of the riparian zone for the benefit of the system. Definitely.
Not many more questions left. So if anybody
just to add.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm at the moment, I'm in the upper Hunter, and to be honest, like some of these systems are like it really pains to see some of these. There's so much like the bank erosion and degradation in some of these areas that haven't been fenced off and protected. Like there's no riparian vegetation. It's just and it dries up. The refugia dry up really quickly. You end up with really shallow pools. Like just there's so much more. It really breaks your heart. I'm not too sure it should fall, to be honest. Like I don't want to stir the pot too much, but I'm not too like why does it have to fall on private? I'm not saying don't do it and go do it, but the rivers in a sense are crown land. With the definition of the width of the river, sometimes there's a bit of ambiguity, I guess, and complexity there. But this should be. We've seen the budget. Yeah, put in riparian restoration there.
Yeah, and definitely there is funding available for a lot of that now. But
yeah, they're all like throwing all the money. Yeah, so where's the environment?
And I do apologise because when I was talking about the Karua before, I did forget to mention that land care is involved in that as well. So thank you for reminding me of that, Robin. It's a land care project as well. So it really was a partnership project. There was lots of different people.
Yes, land care. Yes,
involved
very.
In that. So, and I think if anybody's interested in joining land care or finding out more about land care, MidCoast has a land care program called MidCoast to Top, and that involves lots of different land care groups. So if anybody's interested, absolutely search them out. They're on the internet, on Facebook, and there's certainly more information out there for joining land care as well. So Thank you for reminding me, Robin. I apologise that I missed that when I was talking about the partnership.
I think Landcare also has. Sorry, I think Landcare also has like an important, like, bringing together the community in a shared activity is so important. And so beyond that, there's the benefit, there's the emotional benefit of getting together and doing something together, and a shared vision about protecting the environment.
Absolutely. All right, well, we've gone a little bit over tonight, so I'll take this opportunity, first of all, to say thank you to both Gilad and Matt for presenting this evening. That was fantastic. Even I've learned things, so this is fantastic. But I also want to say thank you to everybody that attended. We couldn't run these evenings without you. You guys are really, we thank you for giving up an evening and joining us, and we certainly hope to see you again in the future.